We, Dr. Rick Richards and I have been talking about where we were in the origins of DOC, and now I just, we're taking advantage of Saturday, October 1st, 2016, Rick's visit to Tuscaloosa, just to not reminisce this time, but to project, where things might have been. My hypothesis is that 52 years after the Surgeon General's report, I would have thought we would be doing a lot better in terms of virtually eliminating cigarette smoking in society. And instead, I heard the other day that if you invested $1 in Philip Morris stock in 1957, it would have yielded 50 years later, 2007, more income than any other single stock on the New York Stock Exchange. So in spite of all of the hubbub and hoo-ha and whatever about smoking and how bad big tobacco is, and we've beaten up on them, it still remains an extremely viable industry. And I think that we should have measured our success in the profitability and the success of the tobacco industry, not just how many people we claimed that we got to stop smoking with a drug, or how many talks we gave to kids or what have you. But Rick, what do you think of the issue? You've always kept an eye on it. We've worked together since '77. We're pleased, but we're more than that. We're also disappointed. What is your overall feeling, and then some individual examples?
Well, the things that should have been predictable, but wasn't, and possibly because of our singular drive and our naivete as to how the world actually works outside of medicine, inside and outside of medicine. In those days, I was under the impression that if you just revealed the truth to people, it would make a difference. Mm. If you just showed young people that it was bad for them, it would make a difference. If you would just point out to fellow physicians the statistics, it would make a difference. What I didn't predict at that time, and still have difficulty dealing with today, is how pervasive the profit motive is across multiple disciplines, that not just molds the thoughts and actions of the public and the government, but how easily it doesn't just metastasize, it morphs. It's much like following a bacteria through several interventions. Over time it becomes different, develops strengths, weaknesses, and try as you might to exploit a weakness of the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry, they just flat out have more money to buy more influence, to change the game, while at the same time leaving in its wake a feeling that something's already happened that made a difference.
Right. They've adapted. We haven't. We have people coming into the field from public health school choosing tobacco control, which is a term I use very advisedly. I hate the term because it's like mosquito control. It's an authoritarian term. And Eric Solberg we're always sort of ridiculing, because he's now getting his doctorate in public health after all these years, and he's seeing, what are they learning? They're learning competencies in public health school, meaning you can pass a test that some of the facts about it, but you're not doing anything. And so you ask yourself, what are people doing about the problem today? And what they're doing is writing a grant, or they're initiating a program, but they're not actually getting out in the streets and doing.
There's very little doing going on. There's very little, in fact, thinking going on. Mm-hmm. There is some reacting going on, mm-hmm. but reaction doesn't, even though the word includes action, doesn't often include action. The science, I think there was probably 20 years ago, I wrote an editorial for American Family Physician about this very topic, that we don't need to spend another $1 billion studying the problem. Mm-hmm. We need to take what we already know and do something about it in terms of interrupting the financial entanglements that take place between the stakeholders.
That's exactly what I said at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia on Monday night, September 26th this year, when I showed the logos of all of the companies that are still in cahoots with the tobacco industry. Then plus the ones in the 80s and 90s that, like Kodak, that used to make the cigarette filters, and Kimberly-Clark that used to make the cigarette papers while they were making surgical gowns, and Pfizer, which used to have the world's largest cigarette flavorings company. Now it makes Chantix. The New York Times, which advertised cigarettes for decades. It really didn't do much on the other side. So we know all of the past allies, but today you still have Siemens, which is every body fluid goes through their equipment when you go to the physician's office or the hospital. They're still making some of the fastest cigarette making machines in the world in their whole cigarette division, advertising and working in cahoots with Philip Morris and others. It's almost like the cigarette industry itself is wondering, how does our fortune remain so good when nobody's catching on to the fact that we're still allied with all these other companies that are still out there? Nobody's getting any heat.
Yeah. Well, just this past week, I was speaking with a high school buddy of Dickie Scruggs about the aftermath.
Scruggs being the attorney who helped engineer the Great Mississippi settlement with the tobacco industry.
And he was asking me, well, what happened to all the money? And I explained to him that the money has become a giant safety net for the tobacco industry because the states have issued 20, 30-year bonds based on the tobacco settlement revenue. So the states have every interest in the world to keep people smoking. Otherwise, they won't be able to pay back their bonds.
They've even gone as friends of the court to oppose certain tobacco litigation, such as in Illinois, where there was this big suit of something like a $10 billion suit against Philip Morris for the use of the term lights and ultralights. And some of the states went in behalf of Philip Morris as a friend of the court to not pay damages so that more money would go to the states.
Yeah, so when you've got such crossed incentives at the regulatory arena of the state governments, at the financial arena of the state governments, of the subsidies to the very entitlements that threaten the it's $20 trillion in debt right now. The tobacco industry, and to some degree also the alcohol industries, are the only way to raise the revenue necessary to continue the programs that have been promised. And I think while there may be fewer smokers in the United States now, it's not many, but the number of smokers, the future is in other areas outside the United States. They haven't even tapped the market, which they're aggressively going after in third world countries and the Far East.
Well, they are doing that now, and also what people don't realize is the cohort of people who smoke today is actually younger than ever in this country. So although you have about 40 to 45 million people smoking today in the United States, just about the same number, a little less than 50 years ago, the cohort, the age of the people smoking today is actually younger than ever. So if I were a tobacco executive, I'd be very happy today. Plus, you don't have a lot of added expenses of advertising. They're doing it with a lot less advertising. They're on the internet, they're doing other things. And when people say, oh, evil tobacco is going after our kids, they have firewalls on their websites to prevent kids from going on the cigarette company websites. It's very hard to make the same case against the tobacco industry today as we did when we were running DOC, because the advertising has changed. That hasn't affected the public health community, which is still looking in the same terms that we were using 30 years ago and calling them the same bad names, saying, oh, they're going after our kids. Show me. You can't go into any community now and see cigarette billboards. You don't see many cigarette ads in newspapers anymore, virtually none.
In the U.S.
In the U.S. But not that many actually around the country, around the world. They're doing it in other ways. They're dynamic and adapting it, but they're being much more subtle about it. The point being is a lot of the funding that's gone into the FDA, which is the new kid on the block, and the CDC, which criticize all the states for not doing very well, and they set up these artificial report cards. Nobody's giving the CDC and the FDA a report card. I would give them Fs. Only in 2012 did they, for the first time, ever spend money on anti-smoking advertising. The CDC finally started its TIPS campaign.
That's right, but that's not anti-smoking.
No, that's true. That's
smoking cessation.
Right, but no, that's true. And also, they didn't use, except for DOC, used brand name ridicule.
Yeah.
So, well, my inspiration for that was Mad Magazine. But I guess the important point to say is that it's all about the people studying the issue now. They're doing what the FDA and the CDC are, what the Counselor for Tobacco Research was since when it was set up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Oh, we're going to find the answer, and we're going to take out the bad ingredients, and we're going to make smoking safe or whatever. That's what the FDA is doing now. They're taking $280 million and giving it to researchers to add more research studies to tobacco. In 1985, I play a quote from Dr. Koop talking about this is not theory any longer. This is proof positive what smoking is doing. When he names all the diseases, and he said over 50,000 research reports in medical journals have said this. Well, that's 85. This is 30 years later. What more did we need? Sir George Godber, who was the head of the National Health in Great Britain, in 1983, my first World Tobacco meeting in Winnipeg, said, and I quote, "How many more world conferences on tobacco is the world condemned to have?" He knew in 83 we already knew enough to act, but who is acting today? People think they get a grant, that's action. It's pretty sad.
Well, it's become a pig trough of individuals who keep going in, taking money, doing meaningless or minimal research, and then they come back and say, I need to prove what I just proved, or I didn't show what I want. Let me change it slightly.
More research is needed.
Yeah. In fact, you may remember when I did the volunteer work at the NCI, I attended a meeting for COMMIT, which I wrote.
Heavy Smokers Intervention Study.
Yeah, I actually wrote the white paper for that, for which the NCI, Joe Cullen, was going to pay Doc $10,000. We never got the check. But at the meeting, I was invited to the meeting of all the potential grantees, and they were sitting at a table around the room, and after the project was described, they all said, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. Sure. Okay. And they provided no feedback. It was just, okay, I can do that. Write me a check. It was a rather shocking first experience with the NCI granting process.
Well, that whole commit was not found to have done anything. Neither did assist. These were abject failures. These were government programs of tens of millions of dollars. Now, in fairness, the $128 million assist program would be looked at with the denominator of what was the tobacco industry spending in the 7 years that the NCI spent $128 million, or $7 million for however many states. Was it 13? Sometimes they used 20. Well, whatever it was, there were 13 or 16 commit states, assist states. These were called the intervention states, and then the rest of the states were control states. $7 million for 7 years. However, of the 7-year program, only, you know how much what the intervention part of it was? Remember how that worked out? First year,
no,
planning.
I don't.
Second year, planning. Well, first year, coalition building. Second year, planning. Third year, intervention. Fourth year, intervention. Fifth year, intervention. Sixth year, evaluation. Seventh year, evaluation. So only 3 of the 7 years of the ASSIST program, the first government program that reached the mass media. Now, it was also the first to use mass media, but with a caveat. So it was $1 million a year for 7 years for an entire state. Let's say Texas had gotten one, which we didn't get. You would have had 10% of the $1 million to be used for counter-advertising. That would have meant of $100,000, that's 10% of $1 million, that $33,000 could have been used in the entire city of Houston for mass media advertising in 1 calendar year. That was the equivalent of 1 large billboard. So, and then it's even further. The only advertising they could use was from the NCI. You couldn't create your own. You had to use what the NCI said. So the whole thing was doomed to begin with.
Right, and I sat in on some of those discussions, and I remember when they were talking about this, I said, if you were writing a grant to see if drugs helped cure pneumonia, and you did not require the potential grantees, to list what drug they were going to choose to treat the pneumonia, then you may well get a report back that drugs don't cure pneumonia because they picked a diuretic instead of an antibiotic. And that's what you're doing with this program here. You're not being specific. You're not requiring them to write what they're going to use. And what happens if, at the end of the day, you've picked the wrong message or the wrong medium? You need to have a component in here that looks at the message and looks at the medium and help determine what already works, when in fact we know the type of media and we can follow the type of media that apparently does work because it's in front of your face every day in the form of cigarette advertising and promotion.
The problem is, with any research on what is effective and what is not, there is so many degrees of separation from your taking out your ad campaign to how do you know people didn't buy the product as a result. The only criterion that I think could possibly be relevant in evaluating effectiveness would be cigarette sales. And the way we know that is cigarette taxes, which fall when there is a decline in cigarette consumption. But people don't do that. I don't know how they measure the effectiveness of these campaigns, how many people liked it in focus groups, because there's no successful effort. The other thing is, if you want to go through the corruption, take a look at the states. You've mentioned the bonds, but take a look at what the lawsuit was supposed to do. It was supposed to bring the money back to pay for the cost of caring for Medicaid expenses that cared for sick and dying smokers.
And prevention.
And prevention fighting smoking. A lot of that money was supposed to be used for that. How much is now being used for that?
Nearly none.
Less than 2% on average. That doesn't even include the states that have sold off their through the bonds, and some of them are now spending zero. So you have, on the state level, less money spent in Alabama today, 2016, than was spent 10 years ago to fight smoking. Hard to believe, but true. The second thing is, we're talking about groups that were set up through the Master Settlement Agreement, like the American Legacy Foundation, which now calls itself the Truth Foundation. That's original. And what does the executive director get paid for that? What are they doing? They're doing press releases. They're doing ceremonial functions, lavish dinners, stuff that we were doing, wouldn't even begin to do 35 years ago. We were out in the streets doing stuff. They're being quoted in press releases. That's all I can figure that the Legacy Foundation is doing. They're not even doing anything. And the salary structure, I'm told that the handful of people that run it are getting in the $11, $15 million range for their salaries. This is money that was supposed to be used to fight smoking. What was our salary in DOC? As in zero?
Zero.
Yeah. So there's that element. Then the Cancer Society, if you were to take what they get in every year, $1 billion a year plus, and what the CEO makes, $1 million a year plus housing allowances and so forth, what is their responsibility on the tobacco issue? If you look at the accountability, logically, a third of cancer deaths are attributable to smoking. That's a minimum. That would mean a third of your budget would go to smoking. That would be $333 million at least. They're not spending, in my estimate, $10 million on smoking, and most of the $10 million, let's say, or $15 million that they're spending goes for salaries. They're not doing their job. Therefore, their accountability is abysmally a failure. Nobody challenges the Heart Association, Cancer Society, and so forth.
Do you remember when Joe Cullen,
the National Cancer Society,
when I met Joe Cullen in his office to discuss the $20 million that he was going to spend on Assist and $20 million on the Commit program, and he was going to give money preferentially to activist organizations that were in the streets actually doing things that
there weren't very many.
No, there were not very many, but doing things that might have an impact. And he called me into his office, and he said, well, I need to tell you that I had a visit, and the American Cancer Societies have approached powerful people in legislature and told them that if we give y'all any money, that they're going to make sure that the NCI's budget is cut.
Right. I heard that in a different way, that they wanted to run Assist. They had to be controlling it ultimately.
Right. That is correct.
So this business of coalitions, one little story you'd appreciate. When I was in Houston at Baylor, I was the physician of the day at the Texas legislature. You could volunteer for a program, and you went up and you ran the clinic. And I did this every 2 years for the entire time I was at Baylor. It was wonderful. You got to go up and meet legislators, and then if there was a free time from your clinic, you could go up and do hearings. It just so happened that there was a hearing on tobacco while I was the physician of the day, and it was a statewide clean indoor air bill that included restaurants. And I went up to the hearing, and some kids were there. They did a remarkable job. They threw a bunch of cigarette packs on the table, and the committee chairman said, well, kids, where did you get these cigarette packs? That doesn't relate to our smoke. They said, we just got them downstairs in the state capitol in the cigarette machines. But the bill did not pass. And one of the reasons was incredible testimony from the Restaurant Association spokesperson, Lena Guerrero, who had been a former Secretary of State, or whatever they call it, for the state of Texas. She was touted to be a gubernatorial candidate, except for one little thing. They discovered that she hadn't actually graduated from the University of Texas as she said she had. And one thing led to another where she falsified some of her records, so she pretty much was a dead-in-the-water candidate from then. So one of the things she did was start a lobbying organization, and one of her chief clients was the Restaurant Association. So I went up to her afterwards, after her testimony, I said, I got to say, that was very impressive. But I have to ask you another question. You say you represented the Restaurant Association, but were you also not really also representing Philip Morris? She turned beet red and she said, well, let me just say this about that. We have a coalition. And that moment, I realized what a coalition was on our side. On our side, which is what the NCI wanted us to do, create coalitions. First year or two of the assist grant, you have to create a coalition. And you remember what coalitions were. Oh, no, can we do that? Can we do that? I don't want to do that. Oh, that's not part of my... Oh, but I'll sign your petition. But coalition on our side of the fence is only as strong as the weakest member. Whereas a coalition on the other side was always, by definition, as strong as Philip Morris. Mm-hmm. And, it's a joke. You can have a coalition of 200 members on the health side, but if they're all namby-pamby, oh no, can we do that? The American Cancer Society wouldn't even sign on to John Conyers' bill in the late 80s. And also Althea, I forget her last name, she was a Detroit City Councilwoman. She wanted to have a bill in City Council in Detroit to ban alcohol and tobacco billboards in the inner cities, where almost all of them were. And Conyers did the same bill in Congress. But the American Cancer Society refused to support the bill. Why would they do that? They said that, alcohol is not part of our mission. Do you know that alcohol has been found to be a very strong independent risk factor for cancer? They would not, the American Cancer Society, to this day, American Cancer Society will not touch the word alcohol. My theory is that partly because they're having all these cocktail parties to raise lots of money for the American Cancer Society.
Yeah, I suspect so.
But they wouldn't be a part of a coalition that I was doing for that reason. They don't have the strength of their convictions. If it makes money for them, they'll do it.
Yeah. Yep.
They join, one last example, Stand Up to Cancer. I don't know if you've been following that organization.
Not much. It's quite hypocritical.
Well, it's genomic medicine fundraising. They're raising money that you're supposed to give out of your pocket to help Bristol Myers Squibb sell $150,000 a pop cancer drugs that have not been found to be more effective than conventional chemotherapy. But there's a cure in your pocket. So you look at the sponsors, the partners of Stand Up to Cancer. Guess who you find? You have publishing partners. Condé Nast, which publishes Vanity Fair, which has cigarette ads. You have Hearst Magazines, which has Cosmo, which has cigarette ads, and so forth. Then you have the Steve Tisch Foundation. How did Steve Tisch make his money? Tisch, Lorillard, Lowe's. And the Safeway Foundation, which has 1,200 Safeway supermarkets. What do they sell? Cigarettes. Yep. And last but not least, you have one of their premier partners, Siemens, which is this huge health conglomerate that talks about this and that, and how we sponsor health science awards and things, and we make the Siemens equipment for hospitals and physicians' offices. And what do they also have? The fastest cigarette-making machines in the world that they advertise to the tobacco industry. We couldn't get, 2 years ago when I first wrote about this, the Cancer Letter and Paul Rayburn of Knight Ridder Science Watch did carry articles, and Myron Levin in California. But this time around, 2 years later, when I sent out a little press release, nobody would pick up on this article. So we actually had an easier time in 77, 78, 79, 80, through the 90s in getting our story out than it is today to get this issue out. Because all people want to study is how many nicotine signs are in convenience stores. In any event, I wanted to get to that hypocrisy and the fact that I don't think organizations are doing today what we did 35 and 40 years ago.